Hello and welcome to another pre-concert video for the Victoria Symphony. As always, I'm your host, Bob Fraser, the orchestra's bass trombonist. Now this is for the first of 3 concerts that will feature the music of Robert Schumann. Robert Schumann's a very important composer from the 19th century, not just because of his composition, but because of his writing about music and his influence in bolstering the reputation of composers such as Brahms. That was, by the way, one of those wonderful digital images created by the Iranian artist Hadi Karimi. Now, he made these for 3 of the composers on this program, luckily, so I'm in luck. So these concerts will feature not just Schumann, but important musicians and friends within his circle. The program starts with an overture. Most overtures are connected to something, an opera, a ballet, an oratorio, but Schumann's overture, inspired by Goethe's epic poem Hermann und Dorothea, is actually a standalone piece. Schumann intended to write something more substantial on this. At this point in his career, which was around 1850, he had only written 1 opera, so this story of Hermann und Dorothea kind of intrigued him. It was about a man named Hermann, of course, helping a group of refugees fleeing the French Revolution. And Hermann ended up falling in love with one of the refugees, Dorothea. Now, this story may have appealed to Schumann on a couple of fronts. One is the revolutions that were happening in Germany at the time, especially the one in Dresden in 1848, which Schumann would have witnessed firsthand. The other front of interest was the rise to power in 1851 of Napoleon III, who was to become France's last monarch. So it was kind of a timely callback, this story. But the overture is all that came out of the project. That's all that ended up being written. And you have this little fragment of the plot line in this overture that Schumann quotes the French national anthem, the Marseillaise. And I think most of you know that if you've heard the French national anthem before. Now, this will be a Victoria Symphony premiere, believe it or not. I could not find this work in our repertoire history. It turned out to be one of Schumann's last compositions. It wasn't published, in fact, until after his death, and he died in 1856. Schumann, unfortunately, was plagued with mental illness through much of his adult life. Some modern experts have speculated that it was bipolar disorder. Schumann admitted himself to an insane asylum in 1854. He unfortunately died of pneumonia 2 years after that. Now, in addition to the works of Schumann and Schumann's circle on these concerts, we're continuing to bring you music by more recent composers. And on this program, we have another work by a composer whom we've featured recently and also over the last few seasons, Vancouver-based Jocelyn Morlock. You'll remember I interviewed Jocelyn quite recently. In fact, I interviewed all the composers for our recent program of Canadian music. We're performing her work for string orchestra on this program entitled Nostalgia. Nostalgia was, appropriately enough for its title, inspired, at least in part, musically, by a sonata for viola da gamba by Johann Sebastian Bach. The viola da gamba, for those of you who are familiar with Baroque music or fans of early music, you'll know what that is. For those of you who don't know, it's a member of a family of string instruments that were bowed and had fretted fingerboards like a guitar. They were different sizes and they all played with the instrument upright like the modern cello. Jocelyn was also inspired by 2 quotations from works of the author Milan Kundera. In the sunset of dissolution, everything is illuminated by the aura of nostalgia. And the other one is, you can suffer nostalgia in the presence of the beloved if you glimpse a future where the beloved is no more. This is a good segue into our next composer, Clara Schumann. She was born Clara Josefina Wieck in 1819 and lived until 1896. She had a fascinating life. I would highly recommend you looking her up, as it's way too detailed for me to outline her life in one of these videos. Some highlights, though: she did not have the conventional life of a 19th century woman. She was raised as a musical prodigy by a very controlling father. And when one of his pupils, Robert Schumann, asked to marry her, Clara's father refused. And believe it or not, it set off a lawsuit by Clara against her own father. Eventually, Robert and Clara prevailed, and they were married in 1840. In the 16 years that they were together, they had 8 children, but Clara continued to compose and perform throughout the rest of her life. For the last 2 years of Robert's life, as I mentioned before, he was confined to an insane asylum. And one of the conditions was that Clara was not allowed visits, which must have been heartbreaking for her. She did get one last visit with him before he died. She outlived Robert by 40 years, so I would imagine that nostalgia was a constant companion for her for the remainder of her life. The Victoria Symphony has never performed any of Clara's compositions before now. Now, before you cry injustice, you'll have to cut us some slack in that almost all her compositional output is not for a symphony orchestra. It's for smaller forces, either solo piano, songs, or chamber music. Her piano concerto in A minor, which is the piece on this program, in fact, is really the only complete work that she left to us that uses a symphony orchestra. And she wrote this as a teenager, believe it or not, between the ages of 14 and 16. Now, speaking of teenagers, in 1844, after the Schumanns had been married 4 years, they were introduced to a 14-year-old violinist named Joseph Joachim. Now, here's a picture of Joachim with Brahms. Joachim is the one standing in this photo. And in case you recognize that name, he became one of the most celebrated violinists of the 19th century. I've actually spoken often of him on these talks because he not only championed earlier violin repertoire such as Beethoven and Bach, but Joachim inspired Bruch, Dvorak, Robert Schumann, and Brahms to write pieces for him. He became a lifelong musical collaborator also with Clara Schumann. Even after her husband's death, they continued to do concert tours together. Now, I mention Joachim because he encouraged his then 20-year-old friend Johannes Brahms, and I'll show you Hadi Karimi's photo of him. He encouraged Brahms to introduce himself, and he gave him an in to present his music to the Schumanns. Now, this would have been in 1853, just 3 years before Robert's death. Now, as I mentioned before, Robert was an influential writer, and he published a periodical called the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, which basically means the New Journal of Music. And in it, he wrote that Brahms was fated to give expression to the times in the highest and most ideal manner. Now, Brahms was an intensely self-critical perfectionist, so having his ego blown up like this didn't necessarily help matters along. Brahms was, as again I've said many times in these talks, he was terrified of writing a full-on symphony. I'm going to put that in air quotes there. That is a composition with all the developed themes and all the structure handed down from Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And it was this latter composer, Beethoven, that Brahms really felt was the bar that he had to get over. It would take years for Brahms to premiere the first of his 4 symphonies. That would happen in 1876, a full 20 years after Robert Schumann's death. But in the early years, he did write works for symphonic forces, and one of these works is on this program. It's the second of his orchestral serenades. Now, this was written in 1859, and it was dedicated to Clara Schumann. Now, the question you're probably asking yourself, how is this serenade different from a symphony? Well, in Brahms's case, not by a lot. It has all the hallmarks of Brahms's compositional techniques, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the essential difference is that the movements are shorter, the feeling of the piece is generally lighter, it's a little less complex, but only slightly. Now, a serenade is actually meant as an entertainment piece, after all, and one of the marks of Brahms's composition that I love to talk about is his use of polyrhythms, and there's lots of them in the first movement of this piece. So let me demonstrate what a polyrhythm is. In most music, the rhythm, the pulse, there are strong pulses that go throughout the music, and they're divided into either 2 divisions or 3, usually. Sometimes music can be organized into measures of 4 beats. In fact, that's actually more common. In fact, that's called common time, 4 beats in a bar. But 4, mathematically, is really just a multiple of 2. So groups of 2, 4, or 8 are called duple meters. Now, a good example of music with a duple pulse, of course, is a march, or anything you'd hear in a club nowadays. So like da 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 dee da da da, right? That's a march. You know, all your dance mix music, that's all duple meter. Now, a pulse that's divided into 3 parts, of course, is called a triple meter. The waltz and the minuet are really good examples. Da 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 dum 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 dum, right? 3 beats in a bar. Okay, so if you have a pulse that's divided into 2 and 3 beats simultaneously, that's what you call a polyrhythm. Now you're thinking at this point, there is music that has 7 beats in a bar, or 13 or 11 or whatever. Really, those aren't as complicated as they sound. If you have 7 beats in a bar, it's usually grouped either 2 plus 2 plus 3, or 2 plus 3 plus 2, or 3 plus 2 plus 2. So everything's either 3s or 2s, or bunches of them together. So that's probably an oversimplification. But when you have a polyrhythm, that's when you have 2 and 3, or otherwise 2 different beat divisions happening at the same time. That's what a polyrhythm is. So let's do this. We have our main pulse. This is our duple pulse. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then you have a triple pulse. So 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, if I do those together, and this is going to take all my musician skills because I'm going to do this in 2 hands, I'm going to do 2 in my left hand and 3 in my right hand. So it'll look something like this. It's really hard to keep those even, but that's basically how 2 against 3 works. Now, Brahms does this all the time. I'm going to play you a really short example from the first movement of this serenade. In the video, I'll put up a screenshot. Notice what happens in the orchestra at the point in the score marked with the letter A. The flutes, they're always easy to find because they're always at the top in an orchestral score. The flutes start playing 6 even notes in a bar. In that second measure after A, you can actually see that they're even grouped in 2 groups with the number 3 over each group. Now, if you look down near the bottom of this page, and they always put the strings at the bottom of an orchestral score, you'll notice that the cellos are repeating a note that's actually a B throughout this passage, and there are 4 beats in each bar. So you have that exact polyrhythm that I just demonstrated, except that it's 6 against 4 instead of 3 against 2. There's no difference between those. It's just that there's 2 of those groups in each measure instead of just 1. So this is what that sounds like. One last thing to note about this piece, and I love talking about this, is its unusual orchestration. Now, ever since symphony orchestras began, the dominant voice in the string section has been the violins, grouped into first violins and second violins. In fact, violins have really been the dominant color of the orchestra as a whole, all throughout the orchestra's history. We even designate the principal first violin as the lead musician in an orchestra. We call them concert masters. The British actually just called them leaders, the leader of the orchestra. Now, Brahms departed from this completely with the Serenade. He actually wrote it completely without violins. Now, what does that do? Well, it gives a whole different sound to the orchestra. There's a much bigger contrast between the woodwinds, who are now the brighter dominant sound because there's flutes and oboes, and the strings, which are led now by the violas, which now have a much darker, a much more low frequency centered sound. Remember my talk earlier this season about Mendelssohn, where I pointed this out. We played those pieces by Mendelssohn in the cathedral, which started with the violas leading the string section. Well, Brahms obviously wasn't the first composer to think of this, and he certainly wasn't the last. And it's an absolutely glorious sound having the violas leading the violins. Plus it gives the violins some much deserved time off because they are really the workhorses of the orchestra. So that's a wrap on this talk. On the next one, we'll explore a little bit more of Schumann and a little bit more of his contemporaries. So I look forward to it. I'll see you then.